Hello everyone. Any questions before we start? So today we are going to start working on user interfaces. And for this lab as well, we have the lab material as a Jupyter notebook file. And there is no slides for this lab, so we are going to go through this Jupyter notebook file, look at some examples and see different elements that we can use in the interface. And there is also this PY version available, but it's directly converted from this notebook version, so it's again the same thing. It is not designed to run it as a whole, so instead you should just focus on some parts of the code that's inside that PY file. So if you are using Jupyter Notebook, if you open that lab 5 IPYMB file, then like this also includes the instructions and some code sections to show as examples. So we are going to use PySimple GUI to create the graphical user interface. And there are also some other options using Python. So for example, if you know how to implement it using a different package, a different library, that's also fine for us. But in the lab, we are going to have a tutorial on this library, and we can help if you have some problems with this library. With other libraries, it's not guaranteed. So this is some library that we need to install it in our Python. So to install it, we can use this Pip Installation code. And if you are new to installing using Pip, then you need to go to the command line prompt to your PowerShell that uses the Python. So if you installed Anaconda, then it's under the Anaconda folder, you will see that there is this Anaconda PowerShell prompt. If you open it, in here you can pip install different libraries. So in this case, it's already installed in my system. Therefore, when I try to install it, it will actually say that you already satisfy this requirement, so that's already installed. But if it was not installed on my system, it's going to download and install it. So there should be the internet connection to install the package. So after we install that package, we can import it and use different modules in it. And there is this additional links. So for example, if you need the API reference for SQL 3, this was for interacting with the database. So we have the connection, we have, for example, how to execute queries. You can look it up in this API file. We have the API for PySimple GUI, and it also includes some instructions, some little demos, some little code segments that help you to do different things. For example, how to get some input from the user, how to read it, how to close the window, etc. We are going to do some examples about that. There is also this complete reference. In this reference, for example, as an element in our window, for example, we may use a button element, and what are all the different details about the button element. So such things are included in this link. So we are only going to look at the portion that we are interested in. But for example, you may need to have some other specific details. For example, we are not going to change the color of anything, but if you want to change the color of some element, then you can do it, and the parameters will be included here. So I'm also using this Markdown option in Jupyter. So for example, this is the first cell is a Markdown cell, and if I double click on that cell, then this is going to show up the symbols that I use for marking down things. So for example, if I include a bunch of hash symbols, it makes it a heading. So the number of the hash symbols determine which kind of heading is this one. So for example, I can use HTML-like tags to color things, to make things bold, or to have some bullet points. And when I run this Markdown cell, instead of getting some output, it converts it to use the style that we introduced. So if you are interested in finding more about how to apply this Markdown style, then these two other links are giving some information about that. So the last one is actually a simpler version that shows that, like, the most used ones, for example, how to include some figures, how to include lines, etc. So these are not really related to the code that we have, but in here we are using some of these, and if you are interested in how that happens, you can get more information from those links. So you may install the PySimple GUI library from the command line prompt, or if you are using the Jupyter notebook, then there is also this exclamation mark. So if you use an exclamation mark, then it puts you to the command line directly. So you can run command line code if you include the exclamation mark at the beginning. So running this cell is also an alternative way to install PySimple GUI library. But again, since it is already installed on my system, this cell is going to output that the requirement already satisfied. But if you are installing it, then it will install it, and you may need to restart your kernel. So while this page is still open, I may need to go through kernel and restart it after installation. So now, after installation, we can use PySimple GUI. So we are going to import it and name it as SG for simplicity. In here we have layouts, so we can define a layout. A layout is a list of elements, and some elements that we may use are going to be text, input, and buttons. So for example, in a very simple program, these will be the required ones. Text will show information to the user. So to give some information, to give some static information to the user, we can use text. For example, what should user do in this page, on this window, or what should be written. So these are instructions to the user, or maybe it may show the current amount of something to the user, etc. So input is to get text input from the user. So for example, let's say we would like to create a new company, then we need the company's name. So we may use this input element to get the name of that company. And buttons trigger the events. So for example, after entering everything, let's say we have a send button there, and when the user clicks on that button, we are going to call some functions, do some calculations, or maybe connect to our database and do something. So this is going to be called together a layout. So the layout is in square brackets, and inside the layout we can also have different square brackets. So here, one square bracket means that those items, those elements within the same square bracket is going to be on the same line. So to show the example, I'm going to run this first. So when you run it, if you are using the Jupyter Notebook, sometimes the window could be like hidden, so you may need to get it on from your taskbar. But if you look at this example in here, we have the name text. On the next line we have this input area, and then we have the surnames text, and then we have another input area. And for the send button and the exit button, they are within this same square bracket. That means that these two will appear on the same line. So for now, I'm going to exit from there. So the new lines that we have here are actually not considered. So what is on the same line is determined by the square brackets. So if I want to put name and this input area on the same line, then I need to lose this square bracket on that line, and I can have something like this. And if the only item on a line, for example in here, is going to be the single item, then I don't need to square brackets in here as well. So this is one line within the square brackets, then comma, this is just one single element here, comma, and then in here as well, for example, I can lose the square brackets. So we use the square brackets to put the items on the same line. So for example, in here, if I run it, so we had some problem there. I guess we may forgotten to do some other elements, but let me just restart the kernel and run it here. Okay, so let me just go back to here. Maybe we did something wrong. Okay, I guess you need to have these square brackets, otherwise we have a problem. Okay, so even something is the single element on a line, we need to have these square brackets. So that was something wrong, I thought. So in the layout we have elements, a list of elements within the square brackets, and if the some of the elements should be on the same line, we use the square brackets to put those elements in the same line. But otherwise, we need to have the square brackets in those individual lines as well. But one option is going to be, for example, putting everything onto the same line. Then you just need to have like the square brackets twice at the beginning and at the end. So this creates the layout, but then we need to create a window and put this layout into that window. So for that, we have this sg.window function. The first parameter is going to be the name or the text that appears at the top of that window, and then we pass the layout to this new window. For example, my first window is written on top of this window, and we pass the layout. And let's look at that layout. For example, we have text elements. So the single parameter of a text function is going to be what's written in that text. We have the input element, and inside the input, so usually we expect the input to come from the user. So the user is going to type something into this input element. Therefore, we are not putting the value of it, but we are assigning some key. So in each of these elements, we can assign a key, and then we can get the result out of these elements using these keys. So it is going to be like a dictionary. Then with this name input key, I can find and get this input, get its value. For example, in this other input, we defined a different key. So for all different inputs, we need to have different keys. With buttons, we write what's written on that button, and when this button is clicked, it is going to create an event with the name of that button. There is this also exit function, a special exit function to use to close our window. So our approach is going to be having a while loop that loops forever, but in case we need to exit from that loop, we are going to break the loop. So at the first line, we are reading the events and values from our window. So this is the window that we created. We are going to read the events and values. Events are related to button clicks. So whenever I click on a button, I find out from the event that which button is clicked, and values are giving me the input values from my layout. For example, I can get the values with that are in these specific input elements. So to see what they look like, we are going to print them on our output. Then if the event is equal to send, so we had a send button there, if it is equal to send, then we are going to print the name and surname that's entered by the user. But if the event is equal to when closed, or if it is equal to exit, so we have the exit button, one option of closing the window is through this exit button, the other option is just clicking this close symbol that's on the window. So in each case we just break the loop, and then breaking the loop causes the window to close. So in here, let's look at the output now. So for example, if I just click on send as it is, then we see that, okay, we clicked on the send button, but the name input is empty string and surname input is empty string. For example, if I type something into this name input, then whenever I click on send, then I see that this is now equal to that string that I put there. So for example, I can type something there, and while showing the or printing the name and surname of the user, for example, in here, how to get the value from the input. So the input has a key. For example, for the name, we use the name input key, and then so we get the values from the window. We printed all the values, so all the values are these. So it's a dictionary. In here we have the key name input, and the value of that is this string that we just written there. So for example, if I would like to get the name input, then using the square brackets from the values, I can get that input and use it in some place. It's a string. I just append this string to my print function. And in here, for example, if I click on exit, then I see that so print events, the event is the exit event, but I still have those last values in the exit event as well. So that's one thing. So let me also again run it one more time. For example, I have some values, but if I exit using this close symbol, then the events and values are gone as well. So exiting with two different ways. So using the exit button, I can still get the values, use it for something, but if it is closed using the close symbol, then I cannot reach the values and the events. So that's just one difference that sometimes you may need to be careful about. Most of the time you do not care how the user closes the program. So in this next example, we are looking at navigation in different windows. So for example, this is one window I have. I can go to window 1. So this is window 1. I have the option to go back to the main menu, or from window 1 I can go to window 2, for example. But within window 2 I can only go back to window 1. From 2 I can go to the main to 2, and I have the exit functionality in all of my windows. So in this case, at the beginning we have a layout. So this is the layout for the main window. We pass this layout to the new window that we create. We have different names for the buttons, but in different windows we may sometimes have the same button names. So we are going to look at it in a minute, but sometimes the same button name may mean that we should do the same thing. For example, go to window 1. In every window that we have this functionality, it is going to do the same thing. It is going to go to window 1. But for example, if the button is saying, okay, enter or create, then in such cases, it may depend on the window that we are currently in. And to keep this window that we are currently in, we may use some other variables. So for example, to keep which functionality that we are currently in. In this navigation example, we just have the same button names, and the same button name means that we are going to do the same thing. So we have our window, we have our loop. Most of the time within our loop, we are going to first read the elements from the window. So these are the events and values. If the event is equal to go to window 1, in this case, we would like to close the current window. So in the last example, when we break out of the loop, we were closing the window. But this time, while our program is running, we would like to close one existing window and have some new layout. So this is called layout 1 for this new window. And we create a new window and pass it to our window variable. So we are actually keeping the window in the same variable. So we close the original one, and then have a new layout to create a new window. And one thing to be careful, you cannot just pass existing layouts to create new windows. So each time to create a new window, you need to pass a new layout. So that doesn't mean that the layout should be different. Layouts can be the same definition, it can have the same definition, but the object of layout should be a new layout object, a new variable. So we just create this new window, and this sg.window function opens the window as well. If the button that's clicked is go to window 2, then what we do is have some different layout for this other window, and we just create and open that window. So in case we click on the back to main button, then we create the layout that's designed for our original window. So that's the same thing, but instead of just passing the layout parameter, since I cannot reuse existing layouts, I just copy and paste the same code here to create that window again. And this is the case when we close the program. And in most cases, you may want to use functions to have a better code. So for example, this code is going to do the same thing. So it has the same functionality, but we just wanted to separate the creation of windows. So to create a main window, for example, this has the layout, but we are going to return the window that's formed within this function. So for window 1 and window 2, we have different functions. Then our loop is going to look better, right? So we just close the window, and for that specific button click, we create the window that's related to that button click, and we pass it into the window variable. We can keep variables to use in different windows. So let me actually first run this example. So it's called the entrance window. It says it has a text saying that welcome, please enter your name. For example, I can enter the name here, and then it opens up a different window, and in this window I have my name stored. So from one window I just passed some variable to the other window, and for example, in here we have the option to update the name. I can write some new string. It opens up this window and it puts that string onto the text. So what did we do? Let's look at. So we have two definitions for a new window. So this is the one that we first entered the name. So that's the entrance part. We have the text and the input part. The input has the key in_name. So whenever the user writes something there, I will get the value using this key. Then this second one is for showing the username within the window. So for that, we may use a parameter. So for example, to this window, we pass the username parameter, and whatever the username is, it's going to be displayed in our text element. So the text element contains a string, so we just concatenate the username, which is a string, to the hello world. And then we have this new name tag, so if you want to enter a new name, you can type it into this input, and this time we reach its value using the update_name key. So these two are the definitions of our functions. Then we store some username parameter, which is currently empty string. And then we create our first window, which is going to be the entrance one, w_name. And within our function, we read the values, and according to the button click, so for example, the enter button, let's look at, is located in our entrance window. So if the entrance window, user clicks on the enter button, we get the name from this in-name input and put the name into the username. So we have the username in this same variable. We close the window, and then we open the new window using this second window. Its title is my program, and it is going to show the username within the window. In case I click on the update name button, which was in this second part, so to update the name of the user, we this time get the value of the username from a different element. So this is a different input area. They have the different names, but within two different layouts, I can use the same key. For example, in here it can be called in name, and in the other layout as well, it can have the same name. Then I need to use this same name as my key. Then we just open the same window. So for example, currently we expect to have this wShowInfo window to be opened if the user is able to click on the update name button, but we close the current instance of this window and open a new instance of that same window. And since we are using functions, it makes life easier because we don't need to have such long code within our if and else statements. If the user clicks on the close button, we just close the program. So using such elements, we can do most things, but sometimes having special elements are more useful for the person that uses the program. So for example, one such element is going to be a list box. So let me actually first run this code. A list box is a set of elements, set of static elements, where the user can choose something. So you have the option to let the user choose one value from that. For example, if I click on OK, the new window is going to say that you have chosen James. So I can get some information from the user with this. Or I can show some information to the user as well. So for example, maybe I would like to find out which students are enrolled to this course. Maybe these are the students that are enrolled to that course. And if we do not choose anything, we also know that. So these two things are what we can do with list boxes. So let me come back to the code. So in here, we gave choices as a tuple of strings. So we have 4 strings in this tuple. And in our layout, so the new one is a listbox, sg.listbox. For the parameters of a listbox, we give a list of objects or a tuple. So these are the choices. These are the things that are included in our listbox. And for each of the elements, we can define the size actually. If you don't define the size, then it's going to assign some size. For example, if I don't include the size for a list box, it is going to have some default size that may be not much useful for me. So for text and button objects, most of the time the default size is enough. But for list boxes, since we have multiple elements, we may need to define the size. For size, we have 2 parameters. So size is equal to these two parameters. The first one is the width of our element. So for example, in here, if I type something like 50, it's going to be wider. And the other element is the number of rows we have there. So I can like directly write 2, for example, here, then it's going to display 2 at a time, and I can use this arrow keys to shuffle through or go through my list. It can be a longer list. Having less elements doesn't make it not happen, so it's possible to do that as well, because the list objects could be updated. So for example, I may add some new users to my lists. So that's the function of size, and in this case we just used as the row count, we just use the length of the choices that we pass. And we also have a key for this list box. Remember, with input we had keys to get the values, and with list box as well. Once user chooses some line, some row, some entry there, we have the option to get the value of it. So therefore we are using the key as well for a list box. And within our while loop, to see what the values look like, we again are printing the values. So let me do that first. So if I click on the OK button, I did not choose anything. So actually nothing is in our chosen name. So the key of this list box is chosen name, and within there is nothing included. For example, let me choose Mike, then the chosen name is going to contain Mike. For example, if I choose Mary, then it's going to contain Mary only. But this is a list of elements. Currently, choosing multiple items is not enabled, but we may enable that. That's why it is returning a list of elements. So this is not directly Jill, this is a list that contains Jill as the first element. So that's one thing about list boxes. Since it returns it as a list, if I need to get the specific item, for example in here, when we click on OK button, if some name is selected, so if the value's chosen name is not empty, then we display pop-up message. So this is something new as well. sg.popup is going to display a new window. So for example, let me choose Mike and click on OK. So this is the pop-up window. It displays single message to the user, and the only option in this window is going to be closing this window. You can click on OK, or you can just click on the close button. But the pop-up window is to give a message to the user in a new window to give some information. And in this case, we just pass a string parameter, and in that string we are writing which value we have chosen. And the different thing is that here, since this item is a list box, we need to get the lists. So values chosen name is a list, and we are interested in the element in index 0. So this index 0 is there because we are using a list box. In a list box, there is the option to choose multiple lines. It's not by default, it is not enabled. We need to, for example, look at the reference to see how to enable it. But because of this functionality, it is returning a list, and for our purpose we are interested in the first thing in that list. And if nothing is selected, then value's chosen name is going to be empty. So if nothing is selected, this is empty. Therefore we go to the else part, showing the string that to the user that says you did not choose anything. So the pop-up windows are a good way to communicate with the user, to give some information in a pop-up window. And list boxes are good for showing information to the user that's about a bunch of objects, let's say, and also choosing one option by the user. So these are like specific options that the user can choose. So for example, in this case, we are not letting user to type something. If you try from the keyboard, the user is not able to type something. User has to choose among these existing items. And because of that, for example, in some cases, we are using foreign keys, let's say, and in the relations table, we need to have a value that exists in the original table. For example, we would like to assign, or let's say we would like to enroll to a course, and the course that we would like to enroll to should be an existing course. So for such tasks, we can get the values using a list box. And one other option is a combo. So the combo is very similar to list box. Again, it displays a list of things, but the visual aspect is different. So in a combo, it only shows a single row, and we can use the triangle symbol to show the multiple items. But since it only selects just one row, when we get the values, it is not going to be a list of things. So in the list box, there is the possibility to choose multiple lines if you enable the option. But then in a combo, you can only choose one single item. So let me run this code for first. So it says choose a name. So this is the same names. I can click on this triangle to list the names, and then I can choose one name. Click on OK. That is doing the same thing. Again with a combo box as well. Let me keep the name empty. I can find out if nothing is selected, etc. The difference is that this time we are using the combo item. The parameters are the same. We use the same key as well. And the only difference is in here, while printing the value of the chosen name, we don't need to include the index 0. If we look at here, let me actually show the output as well. So for example, if I choose the name, then the chosen name is not a list, it is directly the string that I chose. So that's one difference between the combo and the list box. And other than that, this example is very similar to the one that we had. So we see some elements now. Now let's have some interaction with our database. So from this point, we are going to again use the lab3 database. So it had the users, companies, and the partner of relationship. And we would like to use this database, get some information from the database, and display it to the user, this time with a user interface. So for example, let's say we would like to list the users and companies. So let me actually first run this again. So we have a list box that contains the users in our database. So these are the users in our database. We can choose one of the users, and in the other list box, we have a list of our companies. So in here, you will see that some of the names contain curly brackets. That's because they include a space character within them. So this is something about PySimple GUI to show that it is one element. So these are not separate things. It uses these curly brackets. So let me close that for now, and let's look at how did we achieve listing the elements. So this part is using SQL tree, like we connect to our database, and we would like to actually have the list of users and companies as a Python variable, as a Python list. So in our database, we are going to execute the SQL queries to do that. So from the user, let's say we are not interested in other attributes. Let's say we just need the ID, name, and surname. We just get those and append it to the user list. So in the user list, in each item, I have this kind of thing. So I put the ID, the name, and the surname going with a loop. So we just loop through the result set that returns for this SQL query. And then we do the same thing, this time with a different query, and we append it to the companies list. So at this point, I have the list of users and companies. And then I would like to create layout, and layout is going to use PySimple GUI. In my layout, so I write the text saying that, okay, choose a user. So these are actually on different lines. So to see it better, I can put them in different lines as well. But it doesn't matter whether they are on the same line or not. It is determined by the square brackets. So in here, I have two combo boxes, or two combos. And for the first one, I pass the users list, and for the second one, I pass the companies list. And this 7 for a combo box or combo means that whenever the user clicks on that triangle, how many items we show. For example, if I put 15 there, whenever I click on a user, it's going to show 15 users. So you can make it longer, shorter, etc. And the keys for these items are chosen user and chosen company. And we have the button saying that assign as a partner. So actually, within this window, we would like to assign a user to a company. We would like to update something in our database. But so far, we just get the values from our SQL database, and we displayed it in a combo. These can be lists as well. So I can in here use list boxes as well, but then in the later parts I need to change something. Then these are no longer directly referenced. I need to get the zeroth index, so that's one thing to be careful. But you can easily convert combos to list boxes and vice versa. And they are kind of doing similar thing with little differences. But if the user clicks on assign as a partner button, what do? So we need to get the user and the company. And if we run it, so let's first show that, we are actually showing the ID, name and surname of the user together. First, the person should choose some user. If nothing is selected, for example, then assigning it as a partner of a company is not meaningful. So we need to do such checks in our projects as well. For example, if I leave something empty, some required value empty, then what do? The most simple case is going to be to say to the user that you need to fill this area. So in here we are actually doing that. If we look at here, we get the values from the list boxes, from the combos items for the chosen user and the chosen company, and we store them in here because they are going to, so let me actually do it once I select one of the users, then it requires me to choose the company. Actually, sorry, we are not printing. So in the earlier stages, remember we were printing the values to see them how they function. In this case, we did not print it. Let me just include some print function here to print the values from our window. So right now, if I try to assign as a partner, let's look at the output. Then for these keys, so in my window, I have two keys. And for these keys, the values are empty. So if I choose a user, for example, if I try to assign it as a partner, then for the first item, it is going to contain this tuple. So this is a tuple. It has multiple things stored in it. I have the ID, the name, and the surname of the user. And in most cases, when we are interested in updating something, for example, in this case, actually, we need to insert something, right? To assign some user to a company, we need to insert user's ID and the company's ID to a new table, to the partner of table, as a new entry. So I need the primary keys of these tables. So actually, I'm not really interested in the name or the surname. I want to get the primary key, but first I need to have something for this key. For example, chosen user is not empty now. It contains this tuple, but chosen company is currently empty. So I need to make those empty checks. So I get the lines from the values. So that's for giving more explicit look. So I can just instead write it like this, losing this one, for example, and then from the parts that uses the user line, I need to put this one. So let me undo first. But instead, to be more clear, we just first get the lines, and then if the user line is empty, we say, okay, please choose a user. If the company line is empty, then we say, okay, please choose a company. Else, in this else part, we know that user line and company line are not empty. So these are filled. User chose something for those two rows. Then we need to get the IDs of these user and the company. So remember, this is a tuple with multiple elements. We know that in the zeroth index, so since we just get the attributes in order, the first one is ID, and we pass it as the first item in our tuple using the zeroth index. We know that in this index there is going to be the ID of the user. So we get the ID using this zeroth index. From the company line as well, we get the company ID. Then actually, before trying to insert, we need to check whether this exists or not. Because if we just directly try to insert it, and if it has the conflicting primary keys, for example, maybe on the partner of table, I have the entry 11, maybe the user ID 1 is already a partner of the company ID 1, then in that case, I should say that, okay, this user is already assigned to that company, and if I try to insert it, the database is going to give me an error. It's going to say that, okay, the primary key should be unique, but you are giving values that is going to create a conflict. So in that case, actually, in our user interface program, we need to first check whether this already exists or not. So I have the user ID and the company ID. How to check whether this exists or not? So we did similar examples, right? Within our query, we are using parameters. So we would like to select everything. This could be like the user ID something as well. We can just get one attribute as well. That doesn't really matter. We would like to test whether we can get any row with these parameters, and those are for the user ID to be equal to the first parameter and the company ID to be equal to the second parameter. And remember, we need to pass these parameters as a tuple. So the user ID, the first one, is going to replace the first question mark, and the company ID is going to replace the second question mark. We are using this fetch1 function. So remember, we execute the query, and if we use the fetch1 function, it is going to return us the first value if it exists. If it doesn't exist, then this row is going to be equal to none. So in here, if it is equal to none, we insert it. Else, if it is not none, then we are saying that, okay, this user is already assigned to that company. So in this else part, our pop-up message is just showing the user ID and the company ID, and we are saying, okay, this is already assigned. But in the case that we would like to insert it, what we need to do is to execute the insert query. So we need to insert into the partner of table, and we need to insert this user ID and company ID values that are going to be replaced with these question marks within our SQL string. Then we have a pop-up message, this time saying, okay, we successfully inserted this row. And in the case we close, we just break out of the loop. So let me actually run that and show it. So if I try to assign, I need to choose the user. For example, let me choose one user. And then I need to choose the company. So let me choose one company. Then I click on assign as a partner. It says successfully inserted user ID 2 to company ID 4. And then if I try to assign it again, then it's going to say, okay, user ID 2 is already assigned to company ID 4. So this is already assigned, so I cannot assign it again. So maybe to some other company we can insert it, but if we try to insert it again, then it's not going to insert it again. So one thing here, if we are making changes to our database, we need to commit our changes as well before closing that database. So in here I need to also say con.commit if I want to keep my changes. So for example, let me go back 2 to 4, it is going to insert because last time we did not commit. But this time, if I try to use the 2 and 4 again, so I just closed that program and we committed, so therefore it's already assigned. So let's give a 10 minutes break now and we will continue at 9:30. If you have any questions, you can ask. Any questions before we start? So now we have seen examples of getting some input from the user, and we also did an example with an example that involves some query execution, right? For query execution, we are using SQL3 library, and for the user interface part, we are using PySimple GUI, and we are able to have some parameters, pass parameters around. We did some insertion, and in most cases, before inserting something, we may need to check whether this insertion is possible or not. Otherwise, it is going to give an error in the database side, and our window is going to crash. So we don't want that crash happening. So if we are trying to insert something, then the attributes should be in correct type first. For example, if we are inserting some number, it should not contain letters, for example. For not null attributes, we need to give some value. For example, while creating a new user, we need to give some ID, give some name, for example. These have the not null constraint, and we need to give those values. Before trying to execute the insertion query, we should check whether these values are filled or not. Primary keys should not conflict. In here, we first checked whether this primary key exists or not. So we try to get any row that has this user ID and this company ID. If we are able to do that, that means that this entry is already there. This primary key is already there. We cannot insert it again. Then we just give some information to the user about why this is not happening. Also, we have some conditions or constraints about foreign keys. So for example, in here, while I try to insert a new partner of entry, I should have this user and the company in the respective tables. So I cannot assign a user ID that does not exist in the user table. So to prevent this, we use the combo elements. In the combo elements, we show what can be selected, and the user is going to choose among those existing items. So therefore, we do not have any problems in that case. So now let's have a different example. Let me actually run this example first. In here, we would like to insert a new user. And for that, we need the specific attributes within our user table. For example, the name, the surname, and the credit, etc. And for each of these values, the ones that have the not null constraint should be filled. For example, name cannot be empty. I need to enter some name, some credit, etc. But for some of these attributes, for example, for the credit, it has to be a number, right? Therefore, if I write some non-numeric data for the credit, it is going to say that, okay, the credit should be numeric. It should be a number. For status, remember, we have 3 different options, and in such cases, you can give the options to the user like this. So in the project requirements, sometimes we say that this attribute can only get these values, and in such cases, you can just use a combo or a list to let the user choose from the list. And date of birth. In this case, for example, it may be harder for the user to have the specific type of the date. So you may say that, okay, enter the date in this type, but most of the time choosing the date is a better option. So in here we just have this calendar button. So the user can choose any date, and we can put the date string using the correct syntax. And then remember, city was not required in that database. It can be left empty. I can insert this user. It says successfully inserted this new user to the table with the primary key 21. So we did not write the primary key here. So let me try to insert this user again. This time it assigns the primary key ID 22 to the new user. So actually I have two different users with the same information, but their primary keys are different. They are different entries in my table. And if I just go back to this last cell in the part that I list the users, then I will see these new users here as well. So remember, for primary keys, we said they should not conflict. If you give the option to the user to enter any primary key, then you need to check whether this primary key exists or not. But one other option is to determine the new primary key within the code. For example, if the primary keys are like in order, if we are assigning the maximum one as the next one, so maximum plus one could be the next primary key in our list. So in here, we are actually doing that. So let's go through this example code. So we have the status options. It's a list of string. So it doesn't really have to be a tuple. It can be a list as well. So the difference is that with tuples, we cannot change the data. We need to create a new tuple to replace it. But with list elements, we can like modify the list elements. So it can be a tuple as well. In this usage case, it doesn't matter. But to show that these two are possible, we are using a list element here, a list of strings. So in our layout, we have the specific text, and to have them aligned, we define the size of the text elements as well. So let me run it. For example, in here, I have the name, the surname. They don't have the same length, but for this element, I have the same size reserved. Therefore, they are going to be aligned in our layout. So we don't really need to specify the size for text elements, but we can to keep them in a better form. And for each of these items on the same line, I have the input elements. For the status, we have the combo, and we just pass the list of options, the status options, to this combo, and we also have its size. And this tree means that whenever I click on this triangle, it is going to list three elements, which is the size of our status options. And for the elements that I need to get the value out, I'm assigning the key as well. In here, there is one special item. It is the calendar button. So for the calendar button, it puts a button, and when you click on that button, it is going to open up the calendar. Whenever user chooses some date from that calendar, it's going to get the value of the date and put it into the item that's just before the calendar button. So that's how calendar button functions. So it's some predefined functionality. It is going to be a button. User clicks on that button. So then the calendar opens up. I can, for example, in here, go to different years, different months. I can choose a date. Whenever I choose a date, for the item that's just before the calendar item on the same line, so they should be on the same line. If it was on a different line, then I'm not getting any output in any of my elements. But in this case, I have this input, so date of birth input. It's originally empty. I don't expect the user to enter the date directly, but the user can enter the date directly as well. So that's also still possible. It doesn't prevent that, but whenever the user chooses some date, then it's going to put it here using the format that we define here. So since we are always going to, so in this class, we are going to use it for SQL-led databases, and in those databases, we have this format year dash month dash and the day. So the format can stay the same if we are going to use it only for this course. So whenever we choose the date, it is going to put it into the input area for date of birth. As a result, for calendar button, I don't have a key. So I have the key for this input area. And for the city as well, we have the input and the key is city. And whenever the user clicks on the insert button, we are going to, so one option, we can like so as not to try to remember every time which was the name of the value, etc., or which was the order of these values, I put the values into these parameters. But we don't really need to, so I can in here, while checking whether they are empty or not, so for example I made a tuple out of all my values, but instead I can just directly check through the keys, I can check whether some of the values are empty or not, so that's up to you. But if some of them are empty, I'm just displaying message about name cannot be empty, surname cannot be empty, credit cannot be empty. Given that credit is not empty, I'm also checking whether it's numeric or not. So for this second or the third item in index 2, if it is numeric, that's okay. If it is not numeric, then I'm going to display a message saying that it should be numeric. So date of birth and status, I'm also checking whether they are empty or not. If these are not cached, so meaning that all of the required fields are there, so if I go into any of these if and elif parts, I'm going to display the message and then not do the else part. But if I'm not doing in any of these, if I'm not catched in any of these conditions, then in this else part, I'm going to insert the user. But for this new user, I also need a primary key, right? I need the ID of the user. I didn't get the ID directly from the user, which is also possible. You can get the ID from the user. Then you need to check whether the same ID is already inserted or not. So that's one option. In the previous cell, we actually did something like that. But this time we decided to assign the IDs automatically. And for that, we are going to, from the user table, find the maximum ID. So in the user table, we have a bunch of users with different IDs. And among them, we find the maximum. We fetch that. So fetch one is going to return one value. Since this is the result of a function, it is already going to return just single value, and we are returning just one attribute. But we need to say that, okay, for the attribute in the 0th index, this is a number, right? Since this returns a number, this is going to be a number. I don't really need to convert it to an integer. It's already a number. I can just increment it by 1 and keep this parameter in the new ID. Then I would like to have all my parameters in order. Actually, when I created this list of parameters, they were in order that I need to insert it to the user table. The only missing thing is ID here. So ID, name, surname, credit status, date of birth, and followed by the city. So in here, I just append or I have a new tuple. And in this tuple, the first one is new ID. So I need to have this form to say that this is a tuple. And parameters is another tuple. I just have a new tuple out of these tuples, these two tuples. In here, alternatively, I can just, so instead of creating the parameters here, I could have just used it like this as well. So this is my tuple of parameters. That's also possible. But then for these checks, I need to fix them. So now our parameters are ready. We just call the insertion query with the values that are going to replace these question marks. So in order, each of my parameters is going to replace one question mark there. And then at the end, we display a message to the user saying successfully inserted this new user. And since the ID is automatically generated, we may also want to show the ID of this new user. Then we continue the loop. So we did not clear the items. That's also an option. For example, whenever I insert a new user, maybe I'm going to insert some other users as well. I may want to clear these items as well. So we are going to have some examples of that in the later cells. So let's look at this one. Sometimes we may want to update the existing elements in a window. So far we used values from the database to fill the elements, but while we are in the same window, we did not really update the existing ones. So for example, in here, I would like to be able to choose a user and then list the partner companies of that user without closing this window. So maybe I'm going to do some other functionality with the selected company, but in here, I would like to be able to choose a user, click on a button. For example, this time, Paula is the partner of these companies. For example, Brandon is the partner of one single company. Or if I look at this new user, ASD, then that's not assigned to any of the companies. So therefore, I don't see anything when I list the companies of that user. So this time, the difference is that at first, we just keep a list of users. So that's the same thing. From the database, we get the user list. We have a list for companies, but we are not filling that list yet. So we create our layout. For the combo, for the user, we pass the user list. For the list box for companies, to show the companies, I'm still passing the companies list. It doesn't matter. In this part, I can give an empty list as well, because while assigning the layouts, it is going to use the current values of our lists. Then, after we create the window here, we would like to, whenever the user clicks on the List Partner Companies button, get the chosen user's ID. So there is like, you need to have some users selected, right? If I run it, and if I don't choose a user and try to list the partner companies, it's going to give me an error. It is going to say that nothing is selected. So in this code, I do not have a check for whether it exists or not, so it's going to give an error. And for your Windows, if it gives an error, so you need to like interrupt the kernel, but the window will still be there. You need to also like close this window, and like according to your OS, it might be like different steps, but you just go through what is required for closing a window on your operating system. So in here, remember, values contains the keys of the items and the values for those items in our layout, and we would like to get the information from the user key, so which is the combo box. Since this is the combo item, I need to get the combo, but then since the item, so remember, let me actually show something from the previous examples maybe, or let me just show it from the part that we created this user list. So in the user list, I have a bunch of tuples, and the ID is in index element 0. So if I need the ID of the user, after getting that user, I need to write the index 0. So that index 0 comes from the part that I want to use the ID. So it's not about the list box. Remember, with list boxes, we also get the selected item as a list. So if this was a list box, I also need to say that, okay, among the list box items, we are using the only one that's selected, but since the list box can select multiple things, it returns a list. So I need to also index it. But since this is a combo, I just get the ID attributes here. Then we need to find the companies that are that this user ID is a partner of. So in this part, I'm going to fill the companies list. So to fill the companies list, I'm going to execute this query. And in this query, let's look at, we are getting the company ID, company name, and the monthly payments. We are using the partner of and the company tables. We are using the company table because we need the company name and the monthly payment that's only available in the company table. And we are using the partner of relationship because for this user to find the companies that this user is enrolled to or a partner of, I need this table. then this first part is to join the partner of and company tables. And the second condition saying that the user ID for such entries should be equal to the user ID that I'm giving as a parameter. We are only finding such companies, and then we are appending to our companies list and to update the list box in the window. So it is this line. We are saying window.element function, and we are using the key of that list box or for any item. We are going to get it from the window through its key, and we are using the update function. So in here we had the list box, that's key is company. We get that list box, we use the update function on that list box. We can update different things. So for those different things, you can look at the reference. So at the beginning we had some links. One of them is the reference for PySimple GUI. And if you look at it up, so for the list box, the update function can update a bunch of things, maybe the color of the elements, the font, etc. And in this case, we are updating the values. So the values are the items that are listed there. And since we created the new list, so this is initially the empty list, and fill it with the companies of this user, it's going to only contain the companies of this user. If we did not initialize it to the empty list, then it is going to always append the new companies, which doesn't make much sense. So if you are filling and updating some list box, make sure that you first initialize the list to the empty list. We are also committing the changes, because this is going to make, or actually this is not going to make some changes in our database. We really don't need to commit the changes. So that's one thing. So in this other example, we would like to send some credits from a user to some other user. So this is like a bank example. We would like to reduce the amount from a user and increase the amount to or in some other user. So far, when the user clicks on a button, we just executed actually one insertion query. We did not so far do an update query. But to send some amount from a user to another user, what we need to do is to decrement the amount from the sender, and we need to increment the amount to the receiver. So we actually need to execute two different queries. So that's one difference about sending credits. So for example, in our user list, these are the users that we have. For example, I can choose Paula on this side, and on the other side, let's choose Wayne, and I enter the amount, for example, 100. So Paula is 520, Wayne has 100. After I send, so it says successful send. If I look at the users, now Paula has less money or credit and Wayne has more credit, so it's exactly the amount that I entered. And in this scenario, there could be multiple things going wrong. First being, maybe I did not choose a user. I need to choose a from user. I need to choose a to user. And if these two users are the same, so let me also enter the amount, and the amount should be numeric, right? Actually, I'm not sure whether we check whether it is numeric or not in this code, but it should be numeric. But after I write the amount, I should not be able to send to myself as well. For example, this is some other check you may want to do. And one other check is that I should not be able to send an amount that's higher than my current credits. So for example, whenever I try to send a higher amount, it's going to say that insufficient credits. So it's only possible when the amount that I enter is a valid one, then I'm able to send that credit amount. So let's check the code now. So we need the user lists, right? I'm going to get the user lists, fill it with the values from the result set of the query. And in our layout, we have two combos. And in these combos, we are using the same user list. So I pass the same user list, but I'm going to get the values from these lists. I'm going to use them in different scenarios. So for one of them, it's going to be the sender. For the other, it's going to be the receiver. So although I'm using the same user list, their roles are different. I'm getting the values using different keys. For amount, I have an input area, and the key is called amount. I have the send button, and whenever the user clicks on the send button, I'm going to do a bunch of checks. So I get the from user and to user, I get their values. I need to first check whether they are empty or not. If they are empty, I need to say, okay, you need to choose a user for the from part, for the to part as well. So these are like sender and the receiver. And I also need to enter some amount. So some credit amount should be entered by the user. And given that these are filled, then I'm going to this time get the IDs from these parts. So I have the from user. From user is a tuple, right? I have the ID, the name, the surname, and the credit amount. So from here, I need to get the ID. So ID is the 0 index element. And for the to user as well, I get the ID and keep it in to underscore user ID. So I wrote the ID. These are different variables. And then I check whether I'm trying to send to myself or not. So I can also try to send to myself. So I can decrement the amount from myself and increase it to myself again. But it's not really a meaningful operation. Therefore, I would like to prevent that happening. So that's why we check whether these two user IDs are the same or not. And then we have the area, the part about the amount. So at the beginning here, I should also check whether the user has numeric data in amount or not. So we did not actually write that check. So we are directly converting it into an integer. And if the user writes letters in here, it's going to give an error. So that's one check that we need to be doing as well. So in previous cells, we did that. You can you have an example of that. But after converting it to an integer, because anything that we get from the input is going to be a string. So if we expect an integer input, we need to convert it into an integer. Then we first look at whether it is positive or not. So if the user types negative values there, we don't want to do the operation because it's not the thing that we want. If we do a negative amount sending, it's going to be actually receiving from someone else, and we really don't want to do that. So the amount should be positive. Then given that the amount is positive, so we are within an if else. So if it is in the else part, and then we have some other conditions if they are not problematic as well in this else part, then we are this time actually getting the credits of these users. So let me actually run it again. So in here, I display the credit of the users as well, right? These are the credits of these users. But instead of getting this static value from my combo, I'm using a query to get the current credit value. In this application, it doesn't really matter, but in more realistic scenarios, actually, maybe some other user is sending money to the same person at the same time, concurrently. So we are not actually fully resolving the concurrency issues here. But one thing is that we are doing is we are actually, instead of getting the value that we previously filled, so maybe I opened this program a day ago, maybe it is still displaying the credit of the user from previous day. So we put the credit to the user, we have the combo items there. Maybe that's a credit number that's not currently the same. It can be a different value right now. So that's why I'm getting the current credit. So I have another SQL query to get the credit for the user where the ID is the from user ID. So I would like to decrement it from the from user, but I need to first find out the credit of the user. So I fetch one row. So I know that this user should exist. I fetch one row and get as the zeroth index, since I only have the credit attribute, I get the credit of from user. One condition, the credit of the from user should be higher than the amount or equal to it. In the case that it is less than the amount that I enter, then I cannot send such money. Then we are going to say that insufficient credits. So the credit of the from user should be equal to or higher than the amount that we enter. Then if it is not catched in this condition, we can send the written amount. So the order could be reversed. So you may first increase in the other user and then decrease in the sender. But in this instance, we first decrease it from the sender. So order really doesn't matter, given that we do these operations in an atomic manner. So after I execute this one, it should be guaranteed that I also execute this one. Otherwise, I don't want to commit changes. So using the commit option, we can somehow control it. In more realistic examples, these are handled through transactions, etc. You are going to see them in the lecture. But in here, what we are doing is actually we are calling to update queries. So we would like to set the credit of the from user. So we are saying, okay, update the user table where the ID is equal to the from user. And we would like to set the credit to be equal to credit minus this amount. So we decrement the amount. And this is a similar query, but this time we are using the receiver to user ID for the ID of this user. And with the same amount, we are this time incrementing the credit. And then we would like to display some message to the user, because otherwise, if we are not using some pop-up windows to give information to the user is clicking on some buttons but not sure about what happened. Did we send the money? Was it not successful, etc.? So in most cases, we would like to give some information or give some output to the user about what happens when you clicked on those buttons. And then in this part, we would like to update the lists, because if we still keep the same user list, then those users will have the original credits. So they will not be changed because this is kept in a Python list. So the Python list is not aware of the database. So we would like to update the Python list by getting the new values from the database. So we initialize a user list, so an empty list, and then we get the users. So this part is actually the same as this one. So it is getting the users from the database. But since the users information has changed, because we updated for some users, we updated the credit, it's going to contain the new credit amount. So after updating the user list, we actually also need to put these lists to our combo items. So we had combos there, and we update the values of them. So in the layout part, we just pass the list as a parameter, but this is not dynamic. When we update the list, the combo is not automatically updated. We need to call the respective update functions using their keys. We also clear the amount input. So to clear the amount, we reference it using the key of the item. Then we update and set its value to empty. The difference is for list box and combo, we update the values, the item list, and for input, we just update the value. It's a single item. So this time we would like to choose the sender actually in a different window. in most bank systems, you don't send or you don't choose the sender and the receiver at the same time. Maybe you are the sender, you log in as a sender, and then choose the receiver on a different page. So this is similar to a login operation. We would like to log in as a user. So for example, whenever I click on login, it's saying missing user ID. I need to have some user ID. I need to have the name. Maybe this is like the ID and the password, but in this database there is no password attribute for a user. Therefore, we are using the combination of the ID and the name. But it is saying no such user. So I need to know the user ID and the name of that user at the same time to be able to log in. Then if I enter the data correctly, it's going to say, okay, welcome William. So I log in as William. Then I have this window. It shows my current credit. From this list, I can choose any user. And notice that William is not there because I don't want to send it to myself. So I'm going to choose a user, for example, Brandon. Let's send 100 to Brandon. I'm going to click on send button. It says successfully sent 100 to Brandon. My current credit is also updated. And if I look to Brandon, maybe it's not very realistic to see the current credit of the receiver, but we see that that's updated here. And for the other functionality as well, if I enter a higher amount, it says insufficient credits, etc. Maybe I can log in as Paula. ID is 2 and the name is Paula. So I'm going to log out and this time log in as Paula. And in here, I see my current credit. Maybe I would like to send some to William. So this example is actually doing that. And the difference is this time we first have a login window and we would like to keep some login ID. So that login ID is going to be the ID of the user that I log in as. And in the login window, it's actually very simple. I have two inputs for user ID and username. And the condition, whenever I click on that login button, so in here I have the login button, these two should be filled. So that's the first condition. But whenever I fill these two values, they should correspond to an existing user. So that's our other condition. So they should be filled. Okay, we have the pop-up windows if they are not filled. If they are filled, then we get the values and we try to get the ID of such user if it exists. So actually we keep the ID of the user in here as well, but in some other scenarios, what we are entering might not be the ID of the user. But in this case, we have the ID at our hands, but again, we would like to be able to find this ID in the database as well. So whether the ID and the name match at the same time or not, to find out, I execute this query, I fetch one row. If it is none, so if the row is empty, then that means that there is no such user. So with this ID and name combination, maybe there is no such user. But if row is not none, if it is not empty, then that means that there is such user and I get the login ID from row 0. So I was projecting the ID for the row and I just get the ID from index 0 and keep my login ID here. So which user I login as is contained in this login ID variable. It's originally set to -1, but then during the program it will be set to some existing user's ID. So we, in the case that we find a matching user, we say okay, welcome, and then we show the username of this user. We close the current window. We need the list of users to send the money to, so we need a receiver list, and within that receiver list actually we don't really want to send it to ourselves, so we are not going to display the login user within that list. So this is actually the same query for getting the list of users, but we have one additional condition saying that the ID of such users should be different than this login ID parameter. Then we are going to open a new window for sending the credit. So this is actually doing that, but we also want to display for this current user, we would like to display the credit amount. So once we log in, we see the credit amount of this user that we just log in as. To get the credit value for the user that matches the ID of the login ID, we just get the credit and keep it as a login credit variable. So the layout after we log in is something like this. We display the current credits in this text. So the first text is saying, okay, current credit, and next to it I have another text, and for this text actually the value is the login credit as a string. So for any of the texts we were passing strings, right? And that string could be converted from a variable as well. It can be the integer amount of the login credit. And we have a key for this text item because we would like to actually be able to update the value of it. So far we did not give or assign keys to text elements, but in this case we assign a key to this text element because we want to be able to update the value if user clicks on some button, etc. So the to and amount parts, they are the same. We have the send button, we additionally have the logout button if we would like to go back to the earlier page. So in here, let's look at what we are doing. If the user clicks on the send button, then we are going to check whether, or let's actually first look at, okay, we looked at what happens when we click on login. When we click on login, then we go into this new window, and in here we send the amount, right? We send some credits. We have the send and logout buttons. So now we are looking at the send button. Whenever user clicks on the send button, this is actually very similar to the previous cell. We need to check whether a user is selected as the receiver. We are not checking whether we choose a sender or not because we are the sender. The login user is the sender. We check the amount, the enter amount should be satisfied. We then convert the amount as an integer, and the amount should be positive. That's one condition. And the other condition was for the amount to be less than or equal to the credit of the user. So we actually have the current credit stored previously. So if we look at the login part, after we log in, right, we just get the login credit. That's one variable. But maybe after we open this program, maybe somebody send money to us, then again we would like to get the latest value from the database. So therefore we are actually just repeating these lines. So whenever I try to send money, I actually repeat these lines and find the credits or the current credits of the sender, which is the login user actually in this case. We check whether it is less than the amount or not. In this case, we say insufficient credits. Then if the operation is possible, then we are going to do the updates, right? Do these two update queries. One is for decreasing our credits by this amount, but this time instead of choosing the user from a list of users, it is the user's ID that we log in as. So for this user ID we are going to decrement and then increase it for this other selected user, and then we need to do a bunch of updates in our window, right? We need to refresh the user list because in the user list some of the users will have more or less credits. Then we also need to clear the amount. So this is again from the previous cell. One last thing is we need to update our own money, our own credits. So this is actually doing that. So these are the lines that we just repeat. We already see how they function. The additional part is this time I'm updating the element with the key login underscore credit. So this is a text actually. I update the value of it. So for text as well, for text elements, we update their value. So for combo and list boxes, we update values, it's plural, but for input and text, we update their value. Most of the time, for text elements, we actually don't really need to update their values. Therefore, we really did not assign a key for all of our text elements. But for some text elements, we may need to update their values, set them to something else. In such cases, we assign a key to those text elements as well. So for any item that you put into your layout, you can assign a key. But for that to make sense, it should have you should need to update it in some part in your code. So if the user clicks on the logout button, what we do is actually to close the window, the current window, and we get a new login layout and get the new login window. So these lines are the same as we have at the beginning. So they are used to create the login page again. So they are replicating the same thing. And in here, we have the same functionality. So we log in, for example, as William. So at the end, we also commit our changes. So that's one thing to keep the changes. So for example, whenever I log in as William, the credit of the William is going to be the same. For example, I can send all my credit to Wayne. And if I log out, if I close, if I rerun this, and if I, for example, log in as William again, then my current credit is still 0 since we committed the changes. In this code, it is doing the same thing, but we use this time functions to reduce the code complexity. For example, if we look at our loop, so at the beginning login ID is -1, we create the login window, and in our loop, if the user clicks on the login button, we call the button login function. If the user clicks on the send button, we call button send function. In the case the user clicks on logout button, we close the window and create a new login window. So this is similar to the first line that we have. And if we click on the close button, we just close the current window. So the current window might change. We navigate to different windows, but the last current window will be closed, and we close the connection as well. So for example, let's look at create login window, and in create login window, we just have the layout, we form the layout, we create that window and return it as a parameter. And in the case that we create a send window, we need to fill some elements. We have the user list, and for this user, where it is different than the login ID of the current user, because while creating the send window, we should have the login ID. We are using the login ID, which is available here. We just append the list of users, and then we also get the current credit for this login ID user. We form the layout, we open the window. Whenever the user clicks on the login button, this time actually in the function, we are using global parameters. So to say that, okay, there is some window within this code. Actually, for the login ID, you can also keep it or explicitly say that this is the global login ID. But it's not required since we are just using the login ID's value here. We are not updating it. But in the button login function, whenever the user clicks on the login button, we actually need to update the window. Since we are setting it to something else, so as not to use it as a local variable, we need to say that, okay, window is going to be the global window. And for the login ID as well, since we are setting the login ID's value, we need to explicitly say that this is the global login ID. Otherwise, it is going to be only a local variable. But other than that, this is the same code for the login operation, and whenever we click on the send button, again, since in here while sending we really don't update the login ID, but we set it explicitly as well. But other than that, this is the same code. So it's in a better format, maybe it is better manageable in a group project, because for some of the functions you may say that, okay, you are going to implement this function, it should do this and this, your parameters are going to be this and that. So for example, maybe I'm going to pass the user ID parameter, so you will access the user ID and do the specific things using that user ID at the end, return this, or whenever I click on that button, etc., return this and that. So that is going to be it for this lab. And in the next lab, we are going to have a complete example for a small example database. So we had students, teachers enrolling to courses, etc. So we are actually going to have a complete example similar to a project. And in your project, actually, using these elements, it will be enough to implement it. If you have any questions, you can ask. Otherwise, that's the end of this lab. So see you later.